And now, Catherine Flowers, Reverend Lennox Yearwood, and Xiye Bastida with Justin Worland of Time Magazine.
Okay, I'm Justin Worland. I write about climate at Time Magazine, and I'm really happy to be here for this conversation about environmental and climate justice. And so just to introduce the panelists very quickly, we have Catherine Coleman Flowers, who is the founder of the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice. Xiye Bastida, who's a climate justice activist and co-founder of the Re-Earth Initiative, and Reverend Lennox Yearwood Jr., who is the president and CEO of Hip Hop Caucus. So just to start this discussion, I'm sure there's a lot of different levels of knowledge about environmental justice in the audience, and I just want to tee up the conversation to give each of you a minute to just say, when you're thinking about justice in the context of the environmental movement, in the context of the climate movement, what does justice mean to you? And we can just go down the line.
Well, justice means to me that you shouldn't be able to tell who's living next to the factory that's killing people based on their income or their race.
Right.
For me, the environmental justice movement, the main takeaway that I've gotten time and time again is how old it is. We keep thinking that we just came through with the new definitions of climate justice, that we're just getting the wording right. But the first Summit for Environmental Justice was in 1991, 30 years ago. So that's what I keep coming back to, that it's part of our DNA of communities that have been fighting for all of these rights. Environmental justice is embedded in every historical decision that we've made.
Justice is liberation. Justice is longevity. Justice means that people who look like me live longer than they are currently living.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great way to start here. I want to pick up on what you said, Xiye. Thinking about the long history of the environmental justice movement, and as you said, dating back decades, and yet there's been some progress, but there also has been a lot to be desired. And so I want to ask, how have things changed, particularly in the last few years, given the increased awareness of environmental inequities around COVID, the increased conversation at the national level here, but also at the international level? How much have things changed, in these last few years after this long history where there have been some accomplishments, but also some challenges? And we can also just go down the line with this one.
Well, you want me to?
Yeah, go ahead, go for it.
I think the way things have changed, first of all, we're having this discussion at the Aspen Institute. That's a big change. I think the other part that's really different about it is that we have a White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. That has never happened before. So I'm hearing and seeing people talk about environmental justice in places and spaces where I've never heard it before. Now we have to get to the action to get to the justice. But the fact that we're acknowledging the problem, I think about the 12-step program with addiction. The first step is acknowledging that you have a problem. So we've acknowledged that we have a problem. Now it's time to get to the action and change it.
Yeah. Xiye, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the way in which things have changed is that we are redefining our definition of environmentalism. Because from looking at the media, environmentalism was always the straws, the turtles, which are important, but it was never people's health, it was never community health, it was never, like Catherine said, who lives next to the power plants, who lives next to the waste sites. And so we are redefining what justice means in spaces that have never heard climate justice before and have never heard the terms environmental racism before. And mostly within youth, because we have never been so connected before. We are able to really go to every community, and I have a youth there who tells me what the situation is, where they are. And I'm gonna use this opportunity to bring up that the youth of Florida actually wrote a letter to FPL, to the CEO, to ask them for transparency in their net zero plans. And I know that just because somebody reached out to me, and that's happening all around the world. So I think that that's why the environmental justice movement is kind of breathing so much more now, because we're not only working intergenerationally, but globally, and recognizing the injustices that our peers are going through around the world.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Reverend Yearwood, do you have?
Yeah, that's a hard question for many reasons. I would hope, because of time's sake, people would just Google, Google environmental justice movement and go back to either Warren County, North Carolina, or in Texas, or over there with our dear sister Catherine in Alabama. So do that. But the reality is that it's been around for a while, and so it's not new. The fact that we are talking about it like it is new or needs to be kind of put in means that our movement has been a very siloed movement and has put that into a bucket. And so I think that the reality now is that that bucket is literally overflowing with injustice. And so thanks to this new administration, but to be honest, the reality is that that bucket overflows with black, brown, indigenous, queer, male, female, straight, gay, theist, atheist, people's lives who have died because of pollution and dirty water. And so I think that all we have been asking for is a movement that literally tells this government to enforce their laws to protect its citizens. And I think we're also asking for a climate movement to realize that while it is critically important to talk about the animals, the other species called humans that are being killed by policies and by corporations whose business plan means a death sentence for them, to fight them as hard as you do for the other species as well.
Right. Very, very powerful. I'm particularly struck by this idea of overflowing, the idea that this recognition is coming not because of any sort of altruism or something, but that it's just so evident, it's overflowing, that what else can you do? It's very powerful. I want to ask a bit about the federal level here in the U.S. Catherine, you mentioned the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which you are on. Of course, President Biden came to office and signed an executive order, the Justice 40 executive order, which I'll let you explain. But I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about the Justice 40 initiative. And then I'd just be curious, I think we'd all be curious to hear your take on whether the administration is meeting its promises, its relatively big promises on environmental justice.
Well, I think that the administration has made a step in the right direction. Whether it is meeting all of its promises, that remains to be seen. But I think the first step is that 40% of the benefits, especially from this bipartisan infrastructure bill, should go to communities that have been overburdened and under-resourced. And that's what Justice 40 is about. And making sure, I guess the other part of it is, it's going to take not only the administration, but probably everybody in this room and organizations and corporations to press these states to do the right thing. Because a lot of these environmental justice communities are in those situations because these states have decided that it's okay to have sacrifice zones in Cancer Alley, or that it's okay that people don't get sanitation in Lowndes County, that they would rather they have outhouses instead. So we have to make them feel very uncomfortable to not take that 40% and do what they've always done, but send it to their favorite communities or send it to the more affluent communities and leave those other communities behind.
Yeah. Well, Reverend Yearwood, do you have anything to add on that, either at the federal level or also I'd be curious, if you want to pick up on the states also, and anything there?
Well, I think, Catherine, you're pretty good there.
Okay. Well, then let me ask you a different question, which is, another institution that talked a lot about, coming to understand environmental justice is philanthropy, right? And in the last few years. So I want to get your take on how philanthropy is doing. I'm sure there's maybe some philanthropists in the room, but how do you think they're doing? What more needs to be done in that area?
Well, I'm one. I'm senior advisor at Bloomberg. Yeah. I think that one can do more, but I think there needs to be a Justice 40, not only for the federal government, but also in philanthropy. I think that the New School did a study in which they looked at the 12 top foundations in this climate sector. And in that, the New School said that out of that $1.34 billion, out of those 12 entities that are giving, only 1.3% go to BIPOC-led organizations. That's ridiculous. That is not a sustainable movement. We need to have a Justice 40 in philanthropy. 40% of that 1.3 billion should have gone to environmental justice. I know you're not clapping, but I'm okay with that. But 40% should have went to environmental justice organizations and organizations led by BIPOC. If we are in a crisis, and if we are truly going to deal with the crisis we are in, that means that while we are holding the federal government and state governments and local governments accountable to ensure that 40% of the incentives go toward disadvantaged communities, then we in philanthropy have to do the same thing. And I just want to shout out definitely donors of color. I want to shout out obviously many groups, and I want to say I want to say this too. I am happy because I am seeing and having many conversations with other folks in the donor world, from MacArthur and JPB and Hewlett and others who are in the sector, definitely at my house and at Bloomberg. But I want to say this though, we have to do more, because we have also caused harm to this movement, because we have propped up a movement based upon privilege and white supremacy. And so we now have to take away from that to reinvest, to really create not only the movement, but the world that we want to see.
Well, very, very powerful stuff. Xiye, I want to turn to you and shift gears a little bit and talk about the global picture. You've been active with Fridays for Future and for other initiatives to move the conversation on the global stage. What do you think, thinking about COP27? How do you push the climate justice agenda and make sure that it gets the attention that it's due?
Well, I think that the first step and I'm going to build up on what Catherine said before here, the first step in recognizing that we need to bring these conversations of justice to the global level is also recognizing who the culprit is, which is the fossil fuel industry. And the words oil, gas, and coal are not included in the IPCC report. How is that possible? And the other facet of this is when I'm going to these conferences, last COP26, 500 delegates were from the fossil fuel industry. So we have people infiltrating the spaces that are supposed to be where we are, building a better world, and they're being obstructed. And this is happening in every room, which means that we have to not only call these things out, but also look out for each other in the movement. It's not only about being a united front, but being a united body. And this happens in the youth movement as well. Like, I know adult organizations probably have some disagreements, or, we're just humans, that happens, disagreements happen. And the youth movement is the same. And we're also disconnected in some places, but we have to make the effort to reach out to the youth who are in the UN, working for the UN and Youngo, for example, and making those, conscious efforts to build the bridges that have not been built, because we see each other as being from separate worlds. And that doesn't only need to happen among the youth and us bringing that united message to all of these different spaces that we're in, but it needs to happen intergenerationally. I still see people surprised when youth come in and we're saying the exact same things that they've been saying, or we're bringing in different perspectives that are more challenging, and we're bringing in more radical imagination of the future. And the truth is that the only way in which we're going to get to a world that is net zero by 20, not 50, sooner than that, and a world that is just and regenerative, and where youth are learning about the climate crisis in school, the only way in which we're going to get there is when we challenge our own spaces and ask the hard questions so that we can get the right answers. Because we're not asking those hard questions nearly enough. And we started our meeting 2 days ago within the youth movement with let's cut to the chase. No going around. Why have we not been talking to each other before? among these like different organizations. And so that's my perspective. You know, we have to stop talking and challenging each other more.
Yeah.
Can I piggyback on something? Because me and my sister, we were in Scotland together, and we were at this thing where she's talking about, in which they invited the CEO of Shell, and many, particularly young people, were outraged. Other actors were outraged too as well, because this is the situation. And I've been thinking about that, and since we were together, which seems long, but actually short in that process. But the one thing I just want to say, I thought about that, and I thought about, we are fossil fuel abolitionists. That's who we are. Fossil fuel abolitionists. And I thought about that from the standpoint why young people got so outraged, because I thought about the earlier abolitionists, Catherine, who dealt with slavery. How would they have felt if, when they were having Frederick Douglass and Susan B. and all those were coming together, how would they have felt if during the abolitionist meeting of their day, they would have invited the slave trader to that meeting? That's what young people see. They're like, why are you, if you're really serious about abolishing slavery, how are you going to invite the slave trader to a meeting with slaves and those trying to abolish it? And so until we get real serious, young people are saying that this game that we're playing has got to come to an end.
Yes.
Well, I want to follow up on that. I'll start with you, but I'd love to hear everybody's perspectives. Just a bit about how you actually build a movement that is, able to take on these issues. And you said something that struck me on our sort of prep call, where you were talking about moving slowly to reach across, to really get a diverse movement together. So maybe you could talk about what that means and why that matters.
Yeah, I think we got to build a movement, one, on radical love, right? We got to start there. We got to build a movement on this premise that has to be, this is to win, a movement that is a BIWOC, leaderful movement, a Black, brown, indigenous, woman of color, leaderful movement, a woman that is led by women. I think that's the way we're going to win on the climate crisis. I think we also have to be patient. I think many of us have been in this sector, and I think that we have to broaden our movement. And I think in doing that, other communities may not be there at this point. And so we're going to have to move sometimes slow. We're moving fast I think we made some bodily policy mistakes. I think in 2011, when we pushed hard on ACES with the Waxman Markey, and I think then 10 years later, where we are now with Build Back Better, we have not built consensus. And I think that we're seeing that we're not winning on that aspect. And we know that either you shape policy or policy shapes you. And so we are not shaping the policy to confront the climate crisis. And so I think that we need to build power by either using two things. One is either organizing the activism or using narrative and storytelling in media. I think that we put a lot of resources in the organizing, but storytelling, narrative, and media is critical to broaden this movement. And we need to invest in those areas as well, because that will help us to make sure our movement grows, and be patient. Let me just say this. We have to know that we can win. If I say nothing else, is even just know that we can win, and know that I have seen throughout history that organized people beat organized money every single time.
Catherine, do you have anything to add on building a movement? Maybe drawing from your work, building a movement on sanitation issues?
Yes, I think, what I've learned from this experience, first of all, I grew up with parents who were activists. And my parents were part of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, which was the original Black Panther Party that organized around voting rights in Lowndes County, Alabama. But I also have learned throughout this time is that we have to have those hard conversations with people that may not be our allies, and we may not be able to convince everybody, but we may walk out of the room with one or two more than we had before. And I think that's important to have those conversations. I think it's also important that, as Reverend Yearwood has said, is that we have to do the storytelling. The way I've been able to expand this fight, it hasn't been one woman's fight, it's been one woman and all these other women in Lowndes County who have been able to open their homes and tell their stories so people can see what it looks like to not have adequate sanitation. So I think it's going to be very important for us to pass the megaphone sometimes to those people that are in the community suffering from climate justice issues, suffering from environmental justice issues, and lift up those stories. We haven't told enough of those. I think one of the things that moved me to action was seeing an inconvenient truth a long time ago. But it's time for us to also tell the stories of people that are running from fires, the people that are opening up their, trying to get water out of their faucets and nothing is coming out, or the people like the people that we just celebrated getting $150 million in Mount Vernon, New York. What I knew about Mount Vernon before, I think my brother called it money earning Mount Vernon. And when I went to Mount Vernon, see, I can tell how old people are based on whether or not they responded to that. But anyway, that's part of hip hop history. But anyway, going there and seeing a victory occur because people lifted up their voices and told the stories. So we're going to have to continue to do those kinds of things to build a broader movement. And now I'm hearing from people having sanitation issues around the world. Somebody sent me pictures from Ghana where they have something there called suck-outs, that when they flush their toilets, just goes into a trench. Or people from Nigeria who reached out to me, one young man who was working with me through a human rights program at Columbia, talked about how he went to clerk for a judge in Lagos and had to move out of the apartment because of sewage running back into the home. And he talked about how they had sewage lagoons there. They have sewage lagoons in Lowndes County too. So building these broader movements around climate and environmental justice, I think is what's going to get us closer to justice a lot sooner.
Yeah. Well, Xiye, I want to ask you just maybe pick up on the storytelling bit. I know that's a focus for you and it came up before. How do you build movements using storytelling?
Well, I'll build upon what Reverend Yearwood mentioned, which is the power of media, because the stories are there. The media and the communicators of those stories are not doing their job. So, an example is when we have hashtags or themes for strikes. The ones that go very popular and the media picks up on them are listen to the science, strike with us. You've probably even heard them before. But when our hashtags are protect defenders or when they are people over profit, they don't report those headlines, those themes. And so it is about using also the people who we know, who have connections, who can pull strings, to pull all of those for the movement. Because if you think about all of the, money, all of the knowledge, all of the communication that goes into perpetuating fossil fuel, climate denialism, and all of the resources that go into lobbying and upholding the fossil fuel industry, it is nothing compared to what is going on in the storytelling side of climate justice. Because we are just rooting ourselves in our words, and we're not relying on other people to push us through. And it is about passing the microphone to other people, but it is also about owning our space and knowing that it is our time to speak up. It is our time to be heard. It is our time to take those microphones. And when you have a story to tell, especially a climate story that is rooted in injustice, that story needs to be heard even more because people are not have not been exposed to this type of things. And I'll just close this by also building on what Reverend Yearwood said on movements, which is no movement has ever succeeded by thinking that it won't.
That's right.
Every single movement has succeeded because they saw through.
That's right.
And our movement is not a hope, our movement is a goal, because a goal has actionable steps, and that is what we're following.
Well, we have just a minute, so I just want to close and ask, and this is something that probably came up in some ways before, but to ask what success looks like to each of you, and just, if you can give us one or two sentences, and we'll start with you, Catherine.
Well, success to me looks like my grandson not having to fight the same battles I've been fighting all these years.
Yeah.
And that we can leave a world that would benefit 7 generations to come.
For me, success looks like joy, because I think that all of our fights are for a world where we don't have to fight anymore, and what's possible when we don't fight is joy. So I'm just protecting the joy of future generations and also opening up space for joy within the movement now.
Success for me is simply, I guess, Dr. King in the last century talked about equality. And he talked about one day, his children could play with the white children and how they could go different places. And he said he had a dream that they would be able to connect and be judged by your content and not the color of your skin. That was the 20th century when we were fighting for equality. And he ended his speech, obviously, saying, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last. Well, we're still fighting for equality. In the 21st century, we are now fighting for existence. Mm-hmm. And my future, my hope is that we can come together, black, white, brown, red, male, female, queer, straight, gay, atheist, theist, humans. We can come together. And then one day when we win and we beat the fossil fuel industry, then we're going to stand up and say, fossil free at last. Fossil free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are fossil free at last.
Well, thank you so much, Reverend Yearwood, Xiye Bastida, and Catherine Coleman Flowers. Great note to end this session on.
Thank you.